Alrighty. We still have folks who are joining us, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much and welcome for being with us today on the third of our 4 webinar series, Adopting Materials Through an Equity-Focused Lens. Today's focus will be on establishing adoption priorities that really consider the stakeholders and communities of students that districts and other LEAs are serving as they think about their materials and the selection of new materials. Today's webinar will be recorded and available in a follow-up. As I mentioned earlier, we'll have a Q&A session, so please feel free to submit those questions. We will continue throughout the webinar today to answer those questions, but we'll reserve those that are for the guests for an opportunity during Q&A as well. Anything that was asked or has been left unanswered, we'll make sure to follow up on also. We would love it if you were to tag us in your socials at EdReports and mention the hashtag Materials Matter on Twitter, and we will follow you and are happy to see those and read those and share those. I am Shanna Estep. I am the Senior Outreach Specialist here at EdReports, and I have the pleasure of working with both the Director of Field Services and our guests today in a variety of capacities while I'm supporting districts and states on their materials adoption. But I would love to introduce and super excited to introduce today our facilitator, Jess Box, who is our Director of Field Services here at EdReports, and our very special guests, Francisco Villegas, the Vice President of School Transformation for Los Angeles Schools, Partnership for Los Angeles Schools, and Dr. Paula Dillon, who is the Assistant Superintendent for Barrington Public Schools in Rhode Island. Can't wait for you to share your stories with us and your insight and your expertise. And with that, I will pass it to Jess.
Thank you, Shanna. We are really excited to have you all here today. Here is our quick agenda. We're going to start just talking a little bit about how we think about instructional materials as a lever for equity. We're going to dive into what it means to establish adoption priorities. And then we'll spend the bulk of our time hearing from our 2 fantastic guests about what this has looked like in their own work. And then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. As Shanna said, please do share your questions via the Q&A throughout. We really look forward to that conversation. So as Shanna said, this is the 3rd in a series of webinars. Our first webinar was really focused on why materials matter. The second webinar was how to create an instructional vision. And today we're diving into what it means to create local adoption priorities. We're doing all of this through the lens of equity because we know that materials are a really important lever for equity. The adoption and use of high quality instructional materials can ensure that every student is learning grade level, engaging, and meaningful content. We also know that the use of high quality instructional materials can decrease inequities in instruction, both between schools and within schools. So materials play a really important role here. When we think about an adoption process, there are opportunities to center equity throughout a really strong adoption process. So first, centering the needs of students who have been least well served in your system. That lens can apply throughout your whole adoption process. Second, making sure that you have a strong vision for instruction for every student. So what type of instructional experience will every student in your system receive on a daily basis? The third is our focus today, which is focusing on local priorities that reflect the needs and context of your students. And finally, our final webinars in the series, which is later this month, will be focused on including voices and perspectives from a broad range of stakeholders, students, families, teachers, and leaders throughout your adoption process. EdReports, if you are not familiar with us, we are a nonprofit organization, and our focus is to increase the capacity of teachers, administrators, and leaders to seek, identify, and demand high-quality materials. So we draw upon our expert educators to create reviews of instructional materials, and we also work with states, districts, and other education organizations to support smart adoption processes in service of ensuring that teachers have excellent materials nationwide. Our theory of action really reflects that. So first, we identify excellence. This is really the work that we do through our reviews. of materials and the reports that we publish for free on our website. We believe that educators having that information in their hands can increase the demand for excellence in materials. And ultimately, that helps publishers to improve the materials that they offer. Since we founded, we have seen many publishers improving their materials based on the criteria that we share with the field and based on the reviews that have been completed of their previous products. And all of this is really in service of better outcomes for all students. So at EdReports, we have really defined a robust adoption process as this series of 6 steps. The first step is establishing your process. The second is developing your local lens. You then take both of those things to really understand what choices are on the market and winnow that set of choices down to a manageable set that you investigate more deeply. That's where you pilot materials or you study them in groups of teachers. And that deep investigation helps you make a decision to launch and implement the materials. We have found that districts that go through a robust adoption process like this not only find materials that are a better match for their particular context, but also really invest teachers, leaders, and other stakeholders along the way so that when the materials end up in classrooms, folks are eager and excited and know how to use them well in service of student learning. Today, we are focused really on this second step of the process, developing your local lens. That's where establishing local priorities falls. So local priorities are really, we think of them as 2 to 4 priorities for materials that go beyond alignment to standards. Our starting place as an organization is standards alignment. That's what we look at in our first gateways of our reviews. We know that local districts, states, and other education organizations have priorities that reflect who you are as a system and what you need in materials as a result of that. So we think about the process for establishing local priorities as really starting with your local context. Who are your students? Which students have been least well served by your system? What would you need to see in materials in order to meet your students' needs? Also, who are your teachers? What do they need from materials to be successful? What context exists in their experience teaching in terms of the materials you've had in the past, the type of training and development they've had? All of that goes into really understanding your local context. To that, you also then consider your vision for instruction. We talked a lot about this in our last webinar, which you can find the recording of up on our website if you were not able to join us for that. But a vision for instruction is what instructional experience your system really values for students every day. And based on that vision, you can also identify what needs to be true of materials in order to support teachers with realizing that vision. If you take your local context and your vision in conjunction, you can then, as an adoption team, identify 2 to 4 priorities for materials beyond standards alignment. So you may have a priority like strong supports for English learners. If you're serving a population of many students who are learning English, that might be an additional priority that you have. You could have a vision for instruction that prioritizes a particular pedagogical approach. That would be another local priority that you want to make sure the materials reflect that approach. There are many others. Those are just 2 examples, and I know we'll hear many more from our 2 guests today. So what makes strong local priorities? We work with a lot of districts in the field to help them develop these local priorities. And these 4 characteristics are some of the things that we've seen when the priorities really help districts be most successful. So first, they should be specific. What will you see in materials? I gave an example of strong supports for students learning English. That's actually not yet specific enough. You need to really describe what would we see in materials if they were going to meet our students' needs. The second thing is concrete. You want to be able to see evidence or lack of evidence of the priority in materials. So again, how will you measure that that is there? You want to make sure that your adoption committee is really aligned in what the vision of this priority looks like in materials. So you describe it specifically and concretely, and then you need to make sure that everybody who's considering materials has a shared picture of what that looks like, so that as you're doing your considering of materials, you are all sort of coming at it from the same perspective. And then finally, local priorities should be shared broadly. It's really important to communicate these with teachers, with leaders, with students and community members, And as I'll share on the next slide, it's also important to get input from all of those different stakeholders to make sure that the priorities really do reflect your local community. I shared the adoption process on an earlier slide. You have the opportunity to use these local priorities through many steps of the adoption process. So we think about developing them in step 2, but then you use them as you winnow your choices. So if you look on ed reports, there are many programs that reflect alignment to the standards, the instructional shifts, and other characteristics of usability. You are likely not able to consider in depth all of those different options. So you can use your priorities and the evidence from the ed reports to reviews to winnow that large list down to 3 or 4 programs that reflect your priorities. The next step is investigation of materials. Your priorities will determine how your committee will further investigate the materials to look for evidence. So going back to that example of supporting students learning English, there are indicators within ed reports reviews that can provide you with some information on how that looks in materials. You are likely to want to then investigate that in much more depth by digging into the materials themselves and really understanding what that looks like in a particular program. You're likely talking to the publisher at this stage as well. So you're asking questions about your local priorities. Finally, you're making a decision. So you're using the evidence collected during the investigation to make a decision, and you're coming back again and again to these local priorities as you do that. Finally, once you make a decision, your process is not done. You are continuing to build investment in your materials. And so by sharing how local priorities show up in the materials with all of those stakeholders who I mentioned on the last slide, teachers, leaders, students, other community members, you're able to really make the connection between the particular materials that you've chosen and how they are best going to meet the needs of your students and your community. So I have talked a lot about what they are. I'm really excited now to speak with Francisco first about his experience using local priorities in an adoption process. So Francisco, welcome. Really excited to have you with us today. I would love to hear first, what are the goals of your curriculum adoption and implementation? Give us a little context on your work in Los Angeles.
Sure. I'll start by, first, thank you for the opportunity, Jess. And I'll start by just sharing a little bit about the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools, because oftentimes we are a very unique organization, and often it's very common that folks don't understand exactly what we are or what we do. So we're a nonprofit organization, and we manage 19 Los Angeles Unified schools in 3 communities: South Los Angeles, Boyle Heights, and Watts. Our student demographics within those communities are about 89% Latinx and about 9% African-American students, and about 24% English language learners. And we operate schools within LAUSD because as an organization, we believe that we know that the majority of students attend public schools across our nation. And we want to find solutions for all students, not just a few students that go to other options, but public schools is our focus. And that's important for us. It's also important, the communities that we serve are also important to us, because typically when schools entered our organization, they've had a lack of supports that they need to really thrive in those communities. And so our mission is twofold. One is to transform the schools that we manage, and 2, to revolutionize school systems and influence the larger school district by sharing the successes that we're having as an organization. So in my role as Vice President of School Transformation, I get to work on systems implementation. I get to work on systems advising with the larger district, and a big majority of my work is really leading the mathematics team at the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools. So to your question, Jess, around goals, we had 3 big goals. Our first one was we wanted to ensure that everyone had a shared vision for high quality mathematics teaching and learning. And by everyone, we meant everyone, right? Like our school leaders, our teachers, and then eventually engaging our parents and our students as well. We wanted to ensure that we were adopting high quality materials that aligned and worked in service of that vision. And then third, we wanted to make sure that we had really strong implementation systems to ensure that the high quality materials were actually being implemented with integrity.
That's great. Thank you for that context on your work in your school system as well. So would love to hear a little bit about what you mentioned alignment to your vision. What elements of a vision did you call out, and what were those local priorities that you were looking for in your materials when it comes to your math adoption?
Yeah, so I'll start with just the materials and then I'll go to the vision, because I think the vision has definitely influenced what we're looking for in materials now. But this has been a long journey for us. You know, when we started this, I think the larger question of like that we had to ask ourselves is like, why are we adopting new materials? Is it just because it's time to do it, or is it because we really believe that materials are going to play a critical role in what's happening in classrooms? And for us, it was definitely the latter. And so we had to think about, so what's happening right now at that time is around 2013, we were shifting standards in California from the old California standards to the new California standards, which came from the Common Core standards. And with those standards came these instructional shifts. And within those instructional shifts of focus, coherence, and rigor, when we think about the rigor aspects, we were shifting, this was a big shift, right? We were shifting from mostly a focus on procedural fluency to now a more balanced approach that included conceptual understanding and application. But we knew that most of our teachers as learners had experienced mathematics learning mostly procedural, right? And so we knew that this was a shift. And so we knew that our materials had to do more than just be aligned to the standards. Aligned to the standards is really important because one of the most challenging things to see when you go into classrooms is that there's big differences between classrooms and even within classrooms in terms of what students are learning and the experience they're having. So we wanted to make sure that materials were serving in support of those instructional shifts, but also the shifts in instruction that were going to help realize our vision. So that's how we started when we were thinking about materials. One of the things that we definitely were looking for in materials is the design. And so we wanted to make sure that the materials were in lesson plan format, because part of the big challenge with not being in lesson plan format, we didn't want a script. We didn't want to give our teachers a script. That's not what we were after. But the challenge of just giving a traditional textbook to teachers is that we knew we were going to have the same challenge that we were currently facing. And that was that from classroom to classroom, what students were learning and the experiences that they were having were going to be different. And we wanted to ensure that as a baseline, those things were consistent. So, our vision played a big role in this. And we, instead of like sharing a vision statement, what I'll share with you is like 3 questions that were really critical in defining what we were after in terms of high quality math teaching and learning. So the 3 questions are, how might we design a student experience in mathematics that 1, amplifies the genius and assets of all students, 2, makes mathematics a problem-solving journey rather than a binary sorting mechanism of math people or non-math people, and 3rd, that guides all students towards discovering the beauty, power, and joy of mathematics. And so that was really instrumental in thinking about, all right, so what specifically are we going to be looking for in these materials? And for us, we knew that originally when we started with materials adoption back in 2013-14, we were looking for alignment to the standards, alignment to the instructional shifts, and then ensuring that there was some support for the shifts in instruction that we were looking for. But that has evolved with having these essential questions that guide our vision for high quality teaching and learning.
Francisco, your example was so powerful when you talked about you were really looking for lesson plans. That's such a great example of both concrete and specific, that you're not looking for a traditional textbook and you're also not looking for a script. You had a clear vision for what you wanted. I also really love those questions that you shared. As you've added those questions, to your vision, how has that evolved what you're now looking for in materials? It sounds like you've identified some additional priorities that you're looking for.
Yeah, I think, you laid things out so nicely at the beginning. So I think what I'm sharing is really in support of those things, because what we believe aligns really well with what you all have shared as well. You know, with local priorities, we used ed reports to identify only green lit materials, or materials that were aligned to the standards, aligned to the shifts, and passed some usability criteria. For us, that usability criteria went beyond that, because design was very specific for us. Like, we were looking for lesson plans. The other thing is, we also, for example, felt like in order to support shifts in instruction, we were also looking for routines built into the curriculum. So the curriculum that we selected, we've selected a couple, but the most recent one includes not only math instructional routines that give all students an invitation to the mathematics, but also include math language routines, because what we've learned is that students communicating their mathematical ideas in writing was a challenge. And so we felt like literacy in the mathematics classroom was a necessity, and the math language routines were perfect for bringing that in a way that math teachers could connect to the literacy development that they were supporting. So, the routines were one big part of it. Another big part of it is we felt like, oh, so we're bringing in these math language routines. Those are going to provide great supports, language supports for our English learners. However, what we learned was that those haven't been enough, that there are actually on-ramps that students need further language supports in order to either engage with the content, engage with each other, or to produce some product, right? And so we have been learning, and now our criteria continues to change, right? So when we go through the next adoption, we're going to be very critical about what we're looking for, and very specific. We're looking for very specific types of language supports. Not all language supports are the same. And so we've realized we need to do a better job with that. Lastly, I'll say, the Catalyzing Change series for leaders, if you haven't read that, I'd highly recommend that, from NCTM. But, in there they present they present some ideas. And one of the ideas is around rethinking the purpose of mathematics, right? Like, why do kids learn mathematics? And one of those purposes is to understand and critique the world that they live in. So we've been working with Dr. Goldie Mohammed. She is doing a lot of training for our internal staff to help us better understand the things that are really going to help our students feel connected to the learning that they're doing, and feel empowered to understand the world that they live in, but also to change the things that they feel should change. And so that local context, right, and those local priorities become really important in shaping where we're going with curriculum, because we feel it's a huge lever for equity. First, starting with just ensuring that students get access to grade level work every day, then ensuring that they're getting access to great instruction, and then also ensuring that the work that they're engaging with feels relevant and empowering.
Thank you for that. We had a follow-up from one of our audience members that would love to hear a little, you repeat those 3 questions that frame your work, just hear a little bit more about how those questions have translated into your priorities and your work with materials.
Absolutely. So when we think about the first question of like, how might we design the student experience in math that amplifies the genius and assets of all students? A lot of the work that we're doing with Dr. Goldie Mohammed is directly tied to that right now. And so a lot of it has to do with student math identity, student agency, math agency, and also with authority, like who holds the authority in the classroom, right? And we believe that that authority should be shared with students if we really are serious about positioning all students as knowers and doers of mathematics, right? You can't just sit there and get stuff and feel like a mathematician. You have to be engaged in the mathematics. You have to be doing the mathematics. And so that also ties to this idea of like, we want to make sure that mathematics is a problem-solving journey. So the one thing I left out earlier is that we're very specific about what we want. We will only adopt problem-based curricula in math. We're that specific because problem solving is at the heart of what all of our teachers were saying they really wanted to cultivate in students. And so that's another thing that we're focused on. And then lastly, this idea of like, ensuring that students are discovering the beauty, power, and joy of mathematics. The joy piece And the beauty piece are things that we're still working on. The power piece really comes from, we are going to now really be engaging our teachers in training and in supporting them with adapting or modifying lessons to focus on social justice topics, because we have done a lot of surveys and interviews of our students, and our students are telling us that those are the things that would help them feel more connected in math class and see how mathematics is relevant in their world. Those are the things that our students want to engage with and talk about. And therefore, we as leaders have to be responsive to what our students need, because ultimately we serve our students.
That's so helpful to hear. Francisco, how do you think about, like, I heard some things that really clearly show up in materials. You will only adopt a task-based sort of problem solving curriculum. And I heard some of what you say, connecting to the work of Dr. Muhammad. That sounds to me like it could be professional learning and how you're working with teachers. So how do you see, like, what needs to show up in curriculum? And what do you think about being able, like, where you can build shared learning and shared experiences for teachers that help them utilize those materials in ways that also reflect your priorities? What's sort of the interplay?
Absolutely. The long-term goal with curriculum is definitely not that our teachers are tied to a specific curriculum, but we see curriculum as a vehicle for shifting from traditional practice that focus where teachers hold most of the authority and teachers do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of cognitive load, to one where students are doing a lot of that and students hold some of the authority in the classroom. And so we want to make sure that eventually that teachers are seeing the design structure of these things and that they're learning about that and that they're making things their own, right? Like really owning it. There's a process that we go through. So we don't implement with fidelity as an organization. We implement with integrity and as intended. And that gives the wiggle room for teachers to really swap out data sets, for example, right? Or swap out the context. But we have to, as leaders, draw that sandbox, if you will, because we don't just want everything being supplemented. Otherwise, we end up with the design, right? We're not really implementing with integrity anymore, if you will. So I think there is professional learning that goes along with the implementation side of curriculum. And that is where we have invested heavily and have learned a lot in terms of ensuring that teachers have time to apply what they're learning, to ensure that teachers are engaging as learners, to ensure that they have plenty of preparation and planning time that they can do collaboratively, right? But we want them to first really feel empowered by what they're doing and feel comfortable and feel confident. And then we want to also, it's a journey, we want to also equip them with the skill set for adapting materials to meet the needs of their students.
I love that idea of implementing with integrity. I think that's so important, and defining for your system, what does that mean? Francisco, thank you so much. I'm going to turn and we're going to bring you back in a moment, but I want to hear a little bit about Paula's work, and then we'll bring you back together to talk between you and answer some questions. Thank you so much. As we're making that transition, I just want to remind folks to please pop your questions into the Q&A feature. We've got folks behind the scenes who are answering some that come up, and that's also, as you heard, a great source of questions for our panelists. So please keep sharing those. Hi, Paula. I'm so glad to have you here with us today. Thank you for sharing. Would love to start, and I think I have one slide for you on this, for you to just start by sharing. You've done a lot of curriculum adoption in Barrington.
Yes.
As I pull that screen up, let's
Sure.
do that correctly. Would love to just hear briefly sort of your history of where you've been with adoption, and that I think will be a good framework for folks as I jump into some questions.
Sure. So just to give a little context on our district, we're much smaller than LA, for sure. We're on the East Coast. Our school district is about 3,500 students in 6 schools. We're a high performing district. And so, but much like Francisco's journey, there are so many overlaps and very similar steps along the way. We also started around 2013 with the change in the standards. And we began our journey with mathematics because when we evaluated our curriculum, and we looked at our student data between mathematics and English language arts. That's where we needed to do the most work. And so we decided at that time we would begin with our K-5 math curriculum. And we've moved in then to our K-5 English language arts, 6-7 English language arts, 6-8 math, and now we're working on high school math and English language arts. So it's a continuous journey that's grounded in our vision and mission of our students. And when we look at our vision and our mission of the students, that is at center with all of the curriculum work that we're doing. We really wanted to ensure that the curriculum that we were selecting got to the deeper learning standards. That was really critical to us. And so when we defined what we wanted our students to be when they left us, we really wanted them to have these qualities of citizenship, character, collaboration, communication, critical thinking, and creativity. So we were specifically looking for curriculum that would support us in that work. When we began our journey in 2013, we were free to explore curriculum, and it wasn't guided by state requirements at that point. More recently, our state has required all districts to select curriculum that are endorsed by ed reports. But what really was amazing to us is that we had begun this work so long ago, and the curriculum process that we underwent at that time and have continued to and now partnered with ed reports really has led us to the decisions that have been greenlighted. And what we're finding is that we're able to use our deep learning competencies as the core to all of the decision makings. One of the pieces that we did struggle with later on was looking for curriculum that was also grounded in cultural competencies, which wasn't something ed reports originally looked at. And so we've been using different processes to evaluate that along the way as well. So that's basically the history of our journey from 2013 to the present day.
Thank you for that, Paula. So thinking a little bit maybe about the adoption process that you are in the midst of for high school ELA, how I got a little bit of it, but I would love for you to name
Sure.
it. What priorities, what you talked about your vision, how does that translate into priorities? What sort of specifically are you looking for in materials?
Yep. So with our vision, what we did was, as a team, we got together and we said, okay, this is what we want our students, the competencies we want our students to have when they leave us. And so from kindergarten to grade 12, what is it that we need to be doing with our curriculum, with our instruction, to allow them to build those skills and competencies? And what we really wanted and what we landed on is that we wanted our students to basically have the skills to be able to solve any unique problems that they were faced with that challenged them in the world in a way that allowed them to make their future and that of those around them better, right? So that was really the grounding. We framed that around experiential learning, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and the deep learning competencies as defined by NPDL. So as we were looking at curriculum and we were evaluating the cultural competency component, the Common Core Standard component, and the instructional components, we were looking for curriculum that allowed us to achieve those specific components in each grade along the way, and specifically identify those with guaranteed opportunities in each grade. That was really key. What was also key is that we wanted curriculum where we had flexibilities, where we would be able to connect our ELA curriculum with our social studies curriculum. We believe in an interdisciplinary approach, a humanities approach, and we believe that when we silo curriculum, students aren't as successful in transferring knowledge and skills as when we have the opportunity to connect. And so those were very, very important to us as we were evaluating the curriculum, especially around the opportunity for that interdisciplinary connection and the opportunity to connect it back to UN Sustainable Development Goals, experiential learning, and deep learning competencies.
I would love to hear what it looked like to look at curriculum through that lens. So you mentioned some places where you were able to use reports. Like, how did you actually go about evaluating the options that you had?
Yes, so we would at each grade level bring the teams together of teachers, and we would look at the different curriculum for what are the problem sets and the challenges that are raised in for performance-based tasks, what faces, places, and spaces are represented in the curriculum, what are the connections to what's happening in the world around us, and who are the people that are being highlighted in the curriculum. And when we moved this up into the high school, we brought students to the table. And so we have a curriculum committee that includes students and teachers, and they are using the NYU Steinhardt rubric for cultural competencies as their kind of lens in looking for these components. And they're trying to understand whether or not the curriculum is representative of the competencies or the standards that are highlighted in that scorecard rubric as one of the components. They're also looking to see how is the curriculum? Is it a scripted curriculum where they have to go step by step and each unit has to follow the way that it's written, or are they modules that can be moved around and shifted so that they can mirror and match? And our social studies curriculum can be taught alongside our English language arts curriculum. So they're going through each of the options that we've narrowed down to look for those questions. And because the students are involved, we have firsthand the feedback from the people who are going to be involved in the curriculum the most. And so that's been a critical component. We've actually built these teams now all the way down to 4th and 5th grade. We haven't done them K-3 yet, but we've built the teams that involve students at each of our 4, 5, 6, 8, and 9, 12 schools, because it's been such a powerful experience to have them co-thinking and co-creating with us around the curriculum.
That's incredible. I love hearing that you are including students. I think that's such a powerful part of an adoption process. I think my final question for you, Paula, before we bring Francisco back in, I would love to hear, you're looking for a lot of really specific things, and you've got teams of teachers, teams of students looking for that. How have you approached it when, no curriculum is perfect? How have you approached needing to prioritize among different priorities, or sort of making those tough decisions if you don't find something that perfectly matches what you're looking for?
I know most of the time there's this idea that it would be best to have one curriculum that goes K-12 and all schools and all students are working within the same curriculum. In trying to reach our priorities, we were unable to do that. And so we had to make a decision. Do we use different curriculum at different grade spans? And so we ended up, because the priorities were so important to us, making that decision, which we hadn't really intended on making when we first set out to adopt our curriculum. So our K-5 ELA curriculum is different than our 6-7 curriculum, is different than the curriculum that we have decided for 9 to 12. And if you notice, I didn't say 8th grade. And the reason why I didn't say 8th grade is we have still not selected an 8th grade curriculum because we haven't been able to match our priorities to an established curriculum yet. One of the things that we've decided to do is work with the publisher that is engaged in our high school curriculum, who we've really decided that's a great fit for us in our context and what we're looking for and our priorities, to see if there's something that we can co-create or collaborate on that would really fit the unique needs of the humanities approach that we're taking that we can't currently find in something that is already readily available and readily published. Their curriculum is green-lighted for the other grades. So we're confident that this is a possibility, but it was a wall that we hit, and then we had to make a very specific decision. Do we adopt something that's greenlit already, but doesn't hit our priorities and forces us away from a humanities approach? Or do we try to come up with a unique solution and work with the state to see if we're able to go ahead and move in that direction that fits the priorities that we're looking for? So I'm not sure if that's what you were wondering about, because the priorities are unique. It hasn't been easy, and that's why we're just now finishing with our high school adoption. It was only until recently that this particular curriculum that we adopted was given the okay by our state, and we're able to move forward with it.
Thank you so much, Paula. It's wonderful to learn from your experiences. And Francisca, would love to bring you back into the conversation as well. I will just open it up to the two of you for a moment to hear, pretty different contexts you both work in, but I heard a lot of similarities in some of the things you shared. Did either of you have a reaction or question for each other based on the stories you heard? And if not, I've got some more questions, but just wanted to give you a moment in case there were any connections to make.
I think for me, I just want to highlight one of the things that Francisco talked about that I'm not sure if I really spoke to, but this idea of giving teachers time for collaborative work together, looking at student work, calibrating on that work, making decisions about the instructional pieces that they're going to adapt in the curriculum if they're not going to use it as presented. That's been key, and the opportunity to have instructional coaches work with teachers has also been key. So I'm not sure, if that was, resonated, but it just really resonated with me, and I didn't speak to that, and I wanted to make sure that was heard.
Thanks for that. I think that's such an important part of having materials that are common and consistent, is it enables so much more of that collaboration. And teachers really spending their time digging into what are students producing, what are students learning, and how do we work together as a community of educators to learn from each other and make sure students are learning what we intend. Would love to hear from you both. What has surprised you in this work? You both have been engaged in this since 2013. Where have you hit surprises along the way as you have worked on really getting clear on these priorities and how they show up in your materials?
Yeah. I think for me, I don't know if it's a surprise, but I'm glad that it's there. It's this move to the idea of conceptual learning, of really going deep, of looking at the context of the student and the world around them, and moving this idea of failure to be a good thing. I think that's probably one of the highlights for me in terms of what I see with the shifts. We're no longer asking students to enter into curriculum to regurgitate that curriculum. We're asking them to enter into it, to be critical thinkers, to try, to get messy, to get dirty, and to use those trials and errors and collaborative opportunities to learn from what we used to call as failures, but now really see as the primary motivating force in learning. And I also, the reflective piece, right? So if we think about like Kolb's cycle of learning, reflection has been largely missing from older curriculum materials. And now you're seeing that throughout math and English language arts, and the writing and the literacy across both. So that has been a pleasant surprise, I think, with the shifts that we're seeing in the curriculum.
Yeah. We've learned a lot for sure. And I think one of the most important things that I've learned is, as challenging as this shift in mathematics instruction sounds and really is, that our teachers have really responded really well.
Yeah.
Even like teachers, I would speak to a lot of our veteran teachers who had been teaching for over 25 years and had been teaching a certain way and had found some success teaching that way, about early on about this shift and what they thought about it. And they change is difficult for everyone, right? And so the fact that our teachers are responding so well and just in there and trying things, I think says a lot about our teachers and how much they really care about doing the right things
Yeah.
for students. It also speaks about creating conditions for success,
Mhm.
right? Like our job as leaders is to remove barriers, is to create the conditions for our teachers and our students to thrive, right? That's, for me, and just I think for most people, it's leaving the classroom was a very tough decision. And when you leave the classroom, right, you're in a world now where appreciation is not going to come very often, and also, the immediate gratification that you get from working with kids is not there, and so your thinking has to shift to long-term thinking and strategy, and being okay with change is slow,
Mhm.
and but having a clear vision and just working towards that vision. Students, families, teachers have responded very well to things, and so I think that's been a big learning. And there's been a lot of learning about curriculum and the power that it has. um, when I was in the classroom, I tried a lot of different curricular programs and tried a lot of different approaches. And as a teacher, as an individual teacher, found a lot of success. But my calling has always been, how do I have the largest impact in
Mhm.
education? Because, we're here for a short time and we want to have the biggest impact we possibly can. And curriculum has served as a huge, great vehicle for ensuring that there's equity in terms of what students learn and the experiences they have in classrooms. And that it just, if we're very intentional about selecting curriculum that's going to work in
Mhm.
support of our vision and the shifts in instruction that we want to see in the classroom. And when I say we, I don't mean the leaders, I mean we as like a collective force of stakeholders, teachers, parents, students, right? School leaders, district leaders. We, curriculum can play a huge role. And I'll say buying curriculum is step number one, right? Like
Mhm.
selecting the right curriculum, getting it in on time and unpacking it and getting the old materials out, right? That's another step in the process. And then comes where everything can fall flat on its face, the implementation systems. And I
Mhm.
know that that's where this series is going next, but adoption is one step, implementation systems are huge.
To
Yeah.
that point, Francisco, we had an audience question. Somebody would love to hear a little bit more. You said we did not implement with fidelity. We did not implement with fidelity. We did so with integrity and intent. Can you just expand a little bit more about what that means to you? And maybe I didn't say it very cleanly, so maybe if you can say what you said
Yeah.
again, folks wanted that to really stick in a little bit more.
Yeah. Again, I definitely recommend the Catalyzing Change series. I've read it for elementary, middle, and high, and they talk a little bit about this idea of implementing with integrity in there, right? Because and they're not the only ones. There are a lot of other organizations that have published white papers on the difference between implementing with fidelity versus implementing with integrity. And in working with researchers, they always want fidelity, and I have to try to explain to them why we're not doing things necessarily with fidelity, because we're not trying to turn our teachers into robots. That's not what we want, right? We want our teachers to feel like they still have the power to shape what's happening in the classroom with their students. However, what we don't want happening is we don't want our students learning below grade level work. And that's very common for the student populations that we serve, that, because there's unfinished learning and unfinished teaching that they experience oftentimes, there's a gravitation to like, oh, well, let's meet them where they are. Problem with that is that becomes a snowball effect where they never get access to grade level work, right? If you haven't read The Opportunity Myth, that's another great
Mhm.
publication that I recommend reading as well. But for us, implementing with integrity and as intended means that the design of our curriculum is a problem-based curriculum, and it comes in like 3 phases, right? So an invitation to the mathematics, a deep study of the mathematics, and a synthesis of the learning. And so we don't want to mess with the design, right? And so we want to keep that intact. But with integrity means, hey, we're going to use the ideas, and we're going to help the mathematical concepts develop over time, as opposed to like, well, you know, they're not getting it, or this is taking too long, so I'm going to just teach it the old way, or teach it the way that I used to teach it. With integrity means that we're trying on something new, and we're going to try it, and we're going to use the materials the way they were intended to be used. However, we're not going to ignore the fact that implementing curriculum is, 1, ensuring that I understand the content that I'm teaching, and 2, that I understand the students that I'm teaching as well, right? And so implementing with fidelity often ignores that second piece. And that's really important to us, because we want our students to feel connected to what they're learning, and we want our teachers to feel connected to the students and vice versa. And so by bringing in student ideas and teachers listening to what students are interested in, they're able to tweak the context, swap out data sets. Again, it's really important for us as leaders to help set that criteria for teachers, right? And or I should say with teachers, like, what are the things that we are going to do, and what are the things that we're not going to do?
Thank you for that. My final question for both of you, I would love to hear for both of you what advice you have for a district who is just embarking on this curriculum journey now and thinking about a new adoption.
Yeah. For me, it would be to have the teams of teachers who are going to be involved in the implementation be a part of that process, right? To have a very clearly defined vision and mission and priorities established that you can use, so that it's not so overwhelming when you're presented with so many different options. It allows you to have a path that is manageable. It allows teachers to feel they have a voice in the process, and when it's appropriate, to have students involved, as their voice is as important as well. I think the next piece that I would say is that, you know, if you need support in that, to have a facilitator or a coach working with you in the teams to help guide you. Sometimes it's really nice to just be able to roll up your sleeves and dig in and not be the one facilitating, especially if it's your first time. Once you do it, you really get into a momentum, but sometimes that very first time you're doing it, it's great to have a facilitator as a partner with you along the way. But that vision and mission, setting the priorities first, and having the people who are going to be most closely involved in it be at the table, I would say would be my recommendations. And setting time up, they need time. It can't just happen. Like, it can't be like a one-day sit and get. It has to be over time. And it really that time has to be valued.
Yeah, definitely agree with Paula on the vision. And I would say, I listened. I wasn't able to watch, but I listened to the other 2 webinars that EdWeek has put together. Last night I listened to the second one, the one right before this. I highly recommend listening to the stories that the gentleman shared in that webinar, because there's a lot there as well, on top of the things that Paul and I are sharing. But there's a few things. One, if I was going to recommend 2 things, one would be, 3 things. One would be doing what Paula just said around having a strong vision and mission. 2, there's a lot of information out there. So my recommendation would be, look at what EdReports has around recommendations for adopting materials. And third, this one is not connected to adopting materials, but it's connected to implementing materials. I highly, highly recommend the National Implementation Research Network's work around implementation science. Before I learned about NERN and what they do and their implementation science research, we were doing things because we were out in the field, we were listening, we were observing, right? We were monitoring the implementation, and we were responding to, in other words, intervening. This is what the research, the implementation science calls it. They call it an intervention. You're out there, you're monitoring the implementation, and when you see that things are not going right, there's an intervention needed, right? And so I know that this is not about implementation so much, but the implementation matters a great deal. So I think that's a piece of advice that I would say is the adoption piece is important. And so is like getting the new materials in classrooms and the old materials out.
Yeah.
And then also the implementation pieces. Like,
Yeah.
you know, good focus on ed reports for adoption stuff, focus on the National Implementation Research Network's work around implementation science. And those two things coupled together are a great recipe for really thinking differently about curriculum.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you both so much. That's really fantastic advice to leave our participants with today. I'm just going to leave folks with a few closing thoughts, but really appreciate both of all that you have shared in your wisdom and expertise from the work that you have done. Francisco and Paula, it's really a pleasure to have learned from both of you today. Francisco, I'm so glad. It's like I teed you up, but I didn't. I'm so glad you mentioned our adoption resources. In addition to all of the reviews and reports that we have on our website, we also have resources to support folks who are engaged in an adoption process. So we will share this particular resource that is on to support folks with developing local priorities when selecting materials. We'll share this as a part of our follow-up email that will go out with the recording of this webinar. You can see the arrow is pointing to the resources tab at the top of our webpage. Under that tab, there are adoption steps that go through those 6 steps I started the presentation with. And you can find not only this resource, but a lot of other resources linked there as well. If you would like to continue the conversation, we do provide supports, as Paula shared, with districts and states who are engaged in curriculum adoption and other curriculum work. We can support folks with building awareness about the importance of instructional materials, the research behind why they matter, what great materials look like. We can support states or districts with signaling quality, helping to identify what makes great materials. We can support you with conducting your own high quality local reviews or supporting an adoption process if you're considering or in the midst of an adoption process. So if you want to talk more, my email is on the screen there. We would love to continue the conversation with you all. And finally, we have mentioned that this webinar is a part of a webinar series. So our 4th and final webinar in the series is on May 20th. It's focused on stakeholder engagement. We again have 2 great guests who will be joining us for that conversation. Both of them come from Baltimore City Public Schools and will be sharing their experience with curriculum adoption, and really excited to feature them in our final conversation in this series. So right now, just want to say again, a huge thank you to Francisco and Paula. We are so grateful to all that you've shared and to you taking the time to have this conversation today. Thank you to all of you who joined us. Really appreciate you all taking the time, and we hope you join us at the next webinar and look forward to continuing the conversation. Hope everyone has a great day.